when I was 2 months old, he heard of missionaries, Boltons, who were interested in being pioneer missionaries, and they wanted to come and join my parents in their missionary work. And so my father knew that if they traveled, they wouldn't be able to speak the language. So he went to meet them, and there were no bridges or anything, and this involved crossing the Mekong River on a rope. And so they had supplies, and they couldn't take the 2 horses on a rope. So my father, who was from London and used to go and swim periodically in the Thames River, he was quite a swimmer, he decided to go and meet them. And my mother said, "I just have this little baby, 2 months old, you want to leave me?" And he said, "Yes, I feel God is directing me to go and meet these new missionaries." So he went to meet them, and he decided that he would take the 2 horses across the Mekong River. And he was almost on the other side when there was a current or something, and it took him and he drowned.
Oh no.
And I was 2 months old.
Oh, I didn't know
now,
that.
Now, my
oh,
mother
man.
was faced, I had a sister 3 years older, and my mother was faced then, those years, with what was going to happen to her 2 little girls. And she decided other missionaries had children, and they tried to home teach, and they tried to bring them up, and my mother didn't think it was fair for 2 little girls to be brought up kind of like Chinese children and so on. So she heard of this home for missionary children in Hong Kong, and this middle-aged German governess, who was a governess of royalty in Germany, felt somehow God was asking her to become a governess for these missionary children. So she went to Hong Kong and opened up this home for missionary children, because a lot of the missionaries were traveling around in China doing missionary work, and they didn't know what about the children. So there were between 15 or 20 of us, and we called her Auntie Schultz. But it did mean that all those years, I never had a father, and I never really had a mother.
Wow.
She was a wonderful person, but she couldn't very well be a mother to 15. So I grew up in Hong Kong and went to a British school. And so all of this determination, I can hear our headmaster. He'd get up on the platform. We had assembly every day. "Children in a British school must play the game. You play the game." And I always knew I had to play the game. And so
I can almost see him saying that.
with his long robe, you know.
Yeah.
When I was 12 years old, my mother had a furlough. And so now I had gone to school, and what else? I did a lot of studying. I was top of the class, always top of the class. Now in these British schools, in the colonies, because England, Hong Kong was the British colony, if you were top of the class and top of the class, by the time you got to the end, you had a full scholarship to Cambridge, England, to the university. There was nothing I longed for more than to go to England and go to Cambridge. And every year I was top of the class. And then, just before exams, my mother showed up. this person who was my mother, and I loved her because she was my mother, not because she mothered me, you see.
Yeah.
And so I never had this kind of experience of a family with a father and a mother and lots of love and attention. And but I never thought it was a hardship. That was my life, you know. And it was just before final exams, and she had a booking on a ship to go to America to visit her relatives because she had a furlough. And I said, well, but all the exams are coming up, and well, that was too bad, you know, because a furlough is a furlough, and you have to adhere to it. Now, there were two missionary boys about the age of my sister and me, and their missionary work was 5 days' journey away from where I was born in Weishi, in that big house my father built. And so they happened to come to Hong Kong because they too were having a furlough. So they said every once in a while they would visit us. And this one boy was about my age, and he gave me my first kiss. I was 14, 15, yeah. No, my first one was when I was 10. That's another story, 10 years old. Yeah, I remember that. Anyway, so we kind of knew them, you know. We visited them once when I was in Weishi with my sister, and they took us for a hike, and my mother's and their parents said, "Where are you going?" And these two boys said, "Oh, we're just going to hike around." But they sneaked us off to the Mekong River. And they said, "Have you ever ridden on a rope bridge?"
Oh, yes.
And my sister and I said, "No, let's do it," you know. So I have a picture of me on a rope bridge. They put the rope, tied it to a pole on the high bank, and then on the opposite bank they tied it to a low. Are they okay?
Oh, they're fine.
Yeah.
They're laughing.
So what you did is you sat on a saddle, kept your neck out of the way so the rope didn't saw your head off, and then you lifted up your feet, and then you went across the Mekong River. Now, we never told my mother or anybody because my mother would have had a fit at the Mekong River, you know. Anyway, so back to Hong Kong. It was the day before we sailed for America, and these two boys and their parents were in Hong Kong too on furlough. They said, "Let's go for a bike ride." So we rented bikes, and we went way up in the mountains all around Hong Kong. And one of the boys said, "You know, let's get off the main road. There's a path along what we call a nullah." A nullah is a huge 6-foot deep ditch, cemented, where all the runoff from the monsoon storms and everything run off from the mountains. And I turned to say something to him, and my bike went over the nullah. And I fractured both my wrists, and I had concussion of the brain.
Oh my God.
And so they jumped down into the nullah, and my sister shook me and said, "Come on, we have to get home." And I said, "Come on." So they hauled me up out of the nullah and put me on the bicycle, and I had to ride home round curves downhill with concussion and 2 fractured wrists.
Oh my word.
And so, on the way, my sister was beside me. Eleanor, wake up! And then she yelled at me. I was riding my bike, and when we got to the bottom, there was a missionary home we went to, and so missionaries, my bones were sticking out, and she put the bones back where they belonged, and we couldn't go to America the next day. Of course, because I had concussion and I didn't know where I was or what I was doing or anything.
And then you had to take your exams with a concussion?
No. I had to skip school completely.
I was going to say, how could you do that?
No. I had to come to America. And America, what a wild place. People were so noisy, and they were so nosy, and they were so loud, and
Rude.
had a very difficult time. We traveled all the way to Pennsylvania, to Lancaster, and I was 13, and my mother took me to high school, talked to the principal and said I'd like my daughter to go to school. And he didn't ask how old I was, so he stuck me in high school. And I couldn't believe it. All they did were social things. Nobody ever learned anything. This was an American high school, an English school. You go to school to learn,
You're right.
And so I went to high school for a whole year and then came back to Hong Kong. Great relief. Hoped that I somehow would catch up my last year of school and get to go to Cambridge. And went to school for 2 weeks. All Americans were ordered out of Hong Kong because the Japanese were taking over Hong Kong.
Oh, wow.
So, once again, school closed. I had to leave.
I'm going to switch into this seat so I can see you a little better.
Oh, sure. Do you want me here? I'll get over with.
No, it's fine.
There you
There, now I can turn my head while you're telling your story.
Well, is it okay? I'm not talking too much?
No, keep going.
So, 3 days on a boat to French Indochina. 3 days on a train which broke down. And we had to sleep overnight in the train and
Oh, wow.
Go down a bank, and they put a log of wood across the river, and we had to walk across the bank, and then there's another train on the other side, and we got to Kunming, and so we stayed in my mother, and all this time I was kind of bitter. Everything that I dreamed of, nothing. And the only thing, then from Kunming, on a bus on the Burma Road, and then horseback for 10 days, up to Weishi, where I was born. And we got to Weishi, and I just absolutely was determined I was going to finish school. Someday I wanted to be a teacher, and I was going to be a teacher. And so I had heard of this school in Chicago, Illinois. There was a correspondence school. So my sister and I wrote to them, and they sent us books. It took about a month to get to us. And every morning we had a huge veranda. We put up a mosquito netting. And every morning at 9 o'clock, my sister and I met at a desk we had, and come hell or high water, nothing stopped us. And from 9 to 12, we read our sessions aloud. We took the same classes together. And we studied first and second year Latin. I had a terribly hard time with that. American government, which I thought was the most boring thing I'd ever heard. It wasn't anything like your Kings of England, where you could learn about Kings of England, And then we had a wonderful book in British literature, and we read those things aloud, and I was introduced to Shelley and all the British poets, Wordsworth. And I thought, wow. My sister loved animals, and she was far more interested um, in the people, you know. And she'd want to talk to people, and if they were little kids, she just loved these little kids. She just loved them, and we had animals. We had chickens, and our whole. So we would be reading some wonderful poem about Shelley, and there'd be, and she would jump up. Which chicken laid an egg, you know? But anyway, took us 2 years. Now, in the meantime, the man who had left England, whom my father had gone to meet with his wife, had moved into the part of the house that my father had built for any other missionaries, and his wife died. But in the meantime, my mother's sister, younger sister from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, wanted to be a missionary, so she came and she joined the missionaries, and he fell in love, so they married and they were living there.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so then downstairs they had this big guest room with a pipe organ. And so they decided every morning we'd have morning prayers together. And so my Uncle Lynn and Aunt Ada kind of liked to sleep late, you know. So I explained to them, you know, my sister and I are going to school, and we want to start school on time. Well, it kind of worked out for a while. But one morning, my sister and I went down to the room and my mother to have our morning prayers, where we sang a hymn and had prayers, and they hadn't showed up. And it was about 10 minutes before 9, and then they showed up. And so they decided that we would have prayers first. So my Aunt Ada was praying most fervently that God would bless her 2 nieces, Catherine and Eleanor, and would God show his will for them. And I looked at my watch and it was 10 o'clock, so I poked my sister and we jumped up and went and started school. Well, they thought that was the most sacrilegious thing that had ever happened. She was in the middle of a prayer, and we had the nerve. But that's been the guide of my life. You decide to do something and you do it.
Yeah.
And we finally had our high school diplomas mailed to us.
Wow.
And I think I have to stop, but my story just starts, because we finally traveled down to Kunming. Every day we stayed with some missionaries, and every day we were warned that the Japanese were flying over. And the missionaries had a little boy, a baby boy, and a motorcycle. And they explained that if the siren sounded 3 times, that meant the Japanese were right across the border, and they were headed straight for Kunming. And so they said, we have to take our little son on the motorcycle, and there's a room. But you and your sister, be sure you go out, and don't go out the east gate, because there are military facilities all around the east gate. But go around the longer way, around to the north gate, and we'll meet you outside the north gate. We were barely finished breakfast when a siren sounded 3 times, and the missionary and his wife and little boy took off on their motorcycle. Now everybody, thousands of people near the east gate, all flooded toward the east gate, and my sister said, come on, we need to get out of the east gate. And I said, no, he said north gate. So we worded our way, and then the Japanese flew over Kunming and started bombing. And